The scientists who served Nazi Germany designed the rockets used to terrorize Allied cities. When the war ended, their fate should have seemed straightforward. They had served a criminal state, and they had helped give it a new way to kill. But as Germany moved toward defeat, their fate became harder to read, not easier. What they knew made them dangerous, but it also made them valuable. That uncertainty began at Peenemunde, the Nazi regime's main rocket research center. Under Walter Dornberger and Wernher von Braun, Germany pushed rocket research far enough to produce something no other World War II power had: a working long-range missile. That made the men responsible for it far harder to dismiss. They were tied to a military breakthrough that was too important to ignore. It was no longer enough to just ask what these scientists had done for Nazi Germany. The urgent questions instead became, where were they? What did they still possess? And who would get to them first? Some of them would hide. Some would surrender. During the last months of World War II, American and Soviet teams were already racing through Germany, hunting for these men, the documents and the hardware behind the regime's most advanced weapons programs. By the end of the war, punishment was only part of the issue. The biggest question was who would secure them first and what that would cost. If you enjoy high-stakes history told through the decisions that changed everything, subscribe now, because this story only gets darker from here. To understand the context of what would later happen to the Nazi scientists, the moral problem has to come first. It began during the war itself, when their breakthrough had to be turned into a weapon. In December 1942, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, created a special A4 committee to force the Peenemunde rocket program out of research and into mass production. This was the long-range rocket, later known as the W2. It was difficult to build, difficult to move, and still far from reliable. So Speer put industrial troubleshooter Gerhard Degenkolb on the job. Degenkolb wanted Peenemunde treated like a factory. But Walter Dornberger, the army officer in charge of the rocket program, knew it was not ready for mass production. Speer's move imposed production deadlines the site had not faced before. And almost immediately, the scientists behind the missile were trapped between engineering challenges and increasing political demand. But the production pressure created a problem the engineers could not solve with design changes alone. The key bottleneck was labor. By spring 1943, the rocket program did not have enough skilled workers to build the weapon at the pace now being demanded. So Arthur Rudolph, the production manager, alongside other planners, moved toward a brutal solution. They pushed for the use of concentration camp inmates to plug the labor shortfall. And in June 1943, after Hitler raised rocket production above other armaments priorities, prisoners from Buchenwald concentration camp were arriving at Peenemunde within weeks. On August 4th, 1943, the A4 leadership formally recorded concentration camp labor as the primary basis of missile assembly, where prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then replaced when they died. But then the RAF made the Nazis' rocket crisis even worse. On the night of August 17, 1943, British bombers hit Peenemunde with 1,800 tons of bombs, killing hundreds and making it clear that the rockets could not be built safely in the open. Therefore, production was shifted underground to Mittelwerk near Nordhausen in central Germany, a vast tunnel factory. Scientists were transferred there, and concentration camp inmates were forced along with them. The move reduced the threat from Allied bombing. But almost everything else was about to get worse, because what Mittelwerk did not provide was control. Production increased, but too many rockets remained defective, and the whole hidden system depended upon concentration camp inmates, driven through brutal underground conditions. By early 1944, that instability had turned political. The V2 was still delayed and unreliable. Fighter production was in crisis, and Heinrich Himmler's security apparatus saw an opening. The SS moved against the scientists leading the rocket program. Von Braun and other key figures were arrested and accused of defeatism and weak commitment to the war effort. They were released only after Speer and Dornberger intervened, and higher authorities accepted that the missile program could not continue without them. One fact, therefore, was already becoming clear. Scientists like these would be judged less by what they had done and more by what they could still offer. By the summer of 1944, the simpler V-1 had already begun striking London, first launched on June 13th, while the Peenemunde program remained delayed, unreliable, and under growing SS pressure. But by September 1944, the rocket program reached its major breakthrough as the V-2 rocket finally entered the war. The first operational strikes landed near Paris and then London, proving that the long-range rocket the Peenemunde scientists had spent years trying to build could now be used against cities. But the breakthrough came too late to save Hitler's Reich, although what it did prove was the value of the men who knew how to design the missile, build it, supply it, and launch it. Therefore, as Germany weakened in the final months of the war, the Allied hunt for its scientists became more systematic. Allied scientific intelligence teams were no longer looking only for factories and hardware. They were actively hunting the men behind them. The decisive break came when investigators recovered discarded papers from the office of mechanical engineer Werner in the toilets of Bonn University in Western Germany. Osenberg had compiled a nationwide index of Nazi scientists, engineers, doctors, and research sites. Follow-up raids then recovered his card catalog. The Allied hunt was no longer blind. It now had names, programs, and addresses attached to it. So the speed of the Allied hunt intensified. But despite this breakthrough, the German scientists were moving too. By the end of March 1945, the rocket program was being broken up before the Allies could seize it intact. However, the scientists were not simply abandoning their work. Acting on von Braun's instructions, Peenemunde engineers Dieter Husel and Bernhard Tessmann hid the V-2 archive in an abandoned mine at Dürnten. Germany was collapsing, but the technical records of its most sophisticated weapons were not. And this meant the scientists could lose the war, but still retain something worth bargaining for. In May 1945, U.S. Army Major Robert Staver and other American officers pushed into the Nordhausen area before Soviet control tightened, seizing rocket parts and recovering the hidden archive. Yet the Americans were not operating alone. At Cuxhaven, the British launched Operation Backfire, using captured rockets and German scientists to learn how to assemble and fire V-2s. The greater threat to America's own efforts, however, came from the east. After Soviet forces occupied Mittelwerk in July, they sent an inspection team that included the rocket engineer Sergei Korolev to examine what remained of the evacuated rocket centers. Germany had lost the war, but the struggle over its scientists was only intensifying. So the rocket scientists did not wait passively to be found. After Hitler's death, von Braun, Dornberger, and the senior Peenemunde engineers around them chose to surrender to the Americans rather than risk Soviet capture. They sent Magnus von Braun, Wernher von Braun's younger brother, down from their hideout in the Bavarian Alps to make contact. It was a calculation. Captured one by one, they were prisoners, but delivered together with technical knowledge, parts, and a hidden archive behind them, they became a package. And that made the scientists easier to argue for in Washington. The Army's weapons branch wanted the Peenemunde team kept intact for missile work, and military intelligence also wanted them secured before the Soviets reached them. So on July 6, 1945, the Joint Chiefs approved Operation Overcast. Officially, it was temporary, limited, and cautious. A minimum number of German specialists would be held under military control, questioned, and used for American research. So a contradiction now formed within the American military. At the same moment as the American occupation authorities were shutting down legal German research in their zone, Washington was separately opening a protected channel for selected Nazi scientists whose work had military value to work directly from the United States. On paper, Overcast was narrow. But in practice, the first American list already contained 115 rocket scientists. Germany had lost the war, and now its scientists were being turned into a protected American asset. Once Operation Overcast began, the moral ambiguity only continued to widen. Fort Strong in Boston Harbor became the first stop for the newly employed scientists. Some were sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland to work through captured V2 design papers. Wernher von Braun was sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, where the Army based the rocket team, while the V2 launch work took place at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. But what initially looked like a rocket program then developed into something much wider, because on September 20th, 1945, while the Peenemunde rocket scientists were still being processed, the U.S. Army Air Force separately began employing dozens of former Luftwaffe doctors at an Aero Medical Center in Heidelberg. Operation Overcast had started with Nazi rocket scientists, but within 2 months, the transfer of German expertise had already expanded into aviation medicine, high-altitude survival, blast effects, and vision. But then a potential bombshell to the operation landed. On November 4th, Nazi medical crimes became a public scandal in the United States. Yet while newspapers were condemning them, the U.S. Army was already secretly employing them and translating their work into English. But this was not the only immoral practice being absorbed in secret. The deeper escalation came with the rocket scientists. By early 1946, roughly 160 German scientists were already employed in the United States, and almost immediately, the V2 was being pushed toward a new kind of warfare. Von Braun was already arguing that missiles like these should carry atomic warheads, and that changed the meaning of what the Americans had taken, because the V2 was now becoming a model for the missile systems that would go on to define the Cold War. But the continuing absorption of former Nazi specialists into American military life did not stop there. It widened again, this time into intelligence. At Camp King near Frankfurt, former German intelligence officers were first made to write reports, then pushed into anti-Soviet work under Project Keystone. In 1946, American intelligence added Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi general who had run German intelligence against the Soviets on the Eastern Front. By then, the pattern was too clear to dismiss. What had started as a series of exceptions was becoming a rule. If a former Nazi could be used against Moscow, his past did not automatically disqualify him from service in the American military system. But once usefulness had become the rule, temporary arrangements were no longer enough. Operation Overcast had begun in July 1945 as a temporary military program for holding and using selected German specialists. But by 1946, that caution was already being stripped away. The Cold War was heating up. Washington wanted to keep more of the men it had taken, and Overcast was transformed into Operation Paperclip. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency took charge, while Assistant Secretary of War Howard Peterson helped clear the legal obstacles in front of the scientists' program. Files were literally paperclipped to mark the dossiers of the most problematic scientists, delaying State Department review so they could remain in American custody while objections were bypassed. That was where the operation codename came from. What had begun as temporary custody was becoming something far more deliberate. And the more deliberate it became, the more dangerous public exposure would be. But that exposure then came quickly. In early September 1946, Truman approved expansion of the program. 2 weeks later, 5 German doctors already working for the Americans were arrested. But even then, the program did not contract. It widened. On the night of October 21st, 1946, the Soviets launched Operation Osoaviakim, rounding up large numbers of German specialists and their families, including Helmut Grötrup's rocket group and aerodynamics experts, such as Werner Albring, and sending them east. Then, on December 9th, the doctors' trial opened at Nuremberg, prosecuting 23 doctors and SS officials for medical experiments, murder, sterilization, euthanasia, and other war crimes. By the end of 1946, Both superpowers had crossed the same line. But the next question was how much further each side was prepared to go. By 1947, the next stage of the bargain was already visible. The Americans were no longer just taking German scientists into custody and deciding whether to keep them. They were beginning to shield some of them from the full consequences of what they had done. War crimes investigators trying to build the Dora cases, which were war crimes investigations into the forced labor system at Mittelbau Dora labor camp, where V2s were built, were given only limited access to the former Peenemunde rocket scientists stationed at Fort Bliss, while a softer interpretation of responsibility began to take hold. If a man still had Cold War value, that value could now narrow what investigators were allowed to see. But limiting scrutiny did not stop at the rocket scientists. In 1947, American biological warfare officers began drawing more aggressively on German expertise. At Camp Dietrich, Harold Batchelor consulted Kurt Blome on epidemic warfare and assassination methods, while Army planners tried to pull Erich Traub away from Soviet-controlled Reims because of his anti-animal warfare expertise. The same pattern was now widening into chemicals as well. From June 1948, Brigadier General Charles Lukes built working relationships with former Reich chemists such as Walter Schieber, folding German nerve agent knowledge into American chemical warfare planning. The moral threshold, therefore, reduced even further. Men once seen as too compromised were now being approached because their expertise was instead judged as too useful to leave unused. But the more men the Americans drew in, the harder it became to pretend they were only temporary. By the spring of 1948, many paperclip personnel still lacked proper visas, leaving them vulnerable to legal challenge and public scrutiny. So the system was adapted. Border procedures were manipulated, FBI influence was used, and military custody was stretched into something more durable. That was the next escalation. The Americans were no longer just finding ways to use compromised German specialists. They were finding ways to keep them permanently. And once the Americans decided to keep these men, the compromise deepened further. By the late 1940s, former Nazi specialists were being drawn into interrogation, covert research, virology, and clemency politics. John J. McCloy, the U.S. High Commissioner in occupied Germany, moved toward clemency for Otto Ambros, the convicted chemist linked to sarin gas, forced labor, and mass murder, while Walter Schreiber, a former senior Nazi medical official, was working at Camp King during the development of special interrogation methods. Men tied to Nazi medical, chemical, and biological programs were no longer being used only when convenient. American Cold War programs were beginning to rely on them. The next question was what that dependence would now build. The next escalation came in Alabama. In 1950, the core Peenemunde team was moved to Huntsville, where Redstone Arsenal became their permanent American base. That was the turning point. The former Nazi rocket scientists were no longer being treated as temporary post-war specialists. They were now being installed at the center of a long-term American rocket effort. Once that base was in place, the results came quickly. The former Peenemunde scientists helped build Redstone, a short-range ballistic missile, and Jupiter, a longer-range nuclear missile. Then the same expertise pushed into the space race. In 1958, Explorer 1 became America's first satellite. In 1960, around 120 of the former Army rocket team moved into NASA. Von Braun became one of the most prominent figures at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, where Saturn V, the huge rocket that carried Apollo to the moon, was developed. Kurt Debus led the launch center, and Arthur Rudolph helped lead Saturn's development. The more America gained from the Nazi scientists it had taken in, the harder it became to confront what many of them had done before. Von Braun became a U.S. citizen in 1955 and remained in America until his death in 1977. Debus and other leading figures also spent decades serving American rocket and space programs, while Dornberger later moved into American aerospace work. Arthur Rudolph stayed central to the missile and Saturn programs for years, before later war crimes scrutiny over his enforcement of the slave labor system at Mittelwerk forced him out of the United States in 1984. But serious punishment was rare. Walter Schreiber was exposed as a former senior Nazi medical official, allegedly linked to brutal experiments on concentration camp victims, and U.S. officials helped move him to Argentina rather than let the scandal deepen in America. Otto Ambros had been convicted at Nuremberg of mass murder and slavery in the I.G. Farben trial, yet still returned to usefulness after being granted clemency by America. Kurt Blom was acquitted of charges tied to biological warfare and human experimentation, and then pursued for his expertise. In other words, some were investigated and a few were prosecuted. But many of the men the Americans used most heavily were never punished in any way that matched their criminal Nazi records. So the pattern remained the same. America was willing to overlook slave labor, medical crimes, and Nazism itself, if it thought these men could help it gain an edge over the Soviet Union. The Soviets built their own version of this bargain. But in the United States, the results became more public, more celebrated, and harder to separate from national achievement. America got the missiles, the satellite, the moon program, and much of the prestige that came with them. That is what makes the legacy of Paperclip impossible to celebrate cleanly. The triumph was real, but so was the compromise that helped make it possible. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel and makes more videos like this possible. And if the fate of Nazi perpetrators of war crimes interests you, click the video on screen to find out what happened to the men behind Auschwitz and whether justice finally caught up with them.